It was a full house today on the RSnake show with Andrew Cates, Chris Sanchez, and Dustin Cox of Salient Strategies. Salient is a bipartisan lobbying firm based out of Austin, Texas. We had a candid discussion around how bills actually get written and passed, how they aim for bipartisan support, the unintended consequences of bad legislation, the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, political action committees, and more. This is what teachers frustratingly fail to teach in civics class. Without additional delay, please enjoy my conversation with Andrew Cates, Chris Sanchez, and Dustin Cox. Welcome to the RSnake show. I've got a very interesting episode for us today. This is the first time I brought in multiple guests, and of course I went big and went 3 instead of 2. I figure next time I just get a basketball team in here or something and really just blow it out. But with me today, I have the Salient Strategies team. I'm not going to do my normal introductions. I'm going to let you do it so the people listening will be able to hear your voice. Would you please go, sir?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start. My name is Andrew Cates. I go by Andy. Part of the team here at Salient Strategies, senior partner. I'm an attorney. I'm the lone attorney of the group. And I usually introduce myself as a combination of the 2 most hated professions in the U.S., lawyer and lobbyist.
Yeah, I think that might qualify.
Yeah, so Chris Sanchez. I'm also one of the senior partners here at Salient. My kind of background is coming up at the Capitol for 15 plus years, and you get to a point where you got to realize you got to make some real money. So joined up with these guys back in about 2019, and been doing this ever since.
Thanks, Chris. Dustin Cox here. Third co-founder of the firm. We've been doing this for about 3 years, as they all said, and from a policy wonk, appreciate you having us on the show and looking forward to kind of getting into this today.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again, guys. This is, I know it's kind of difficult to take this much time out of your day, especially for something like this, but I really appreciate you coming down for a number of reasons, which we will get into. But before I do that, one of the things I think is most interesting is that I happen to know that you guys have different political views. Little secret about you guys, which I think is actually really compelling. I do not want you to disclose to the camera during this episode what you are and what your beliefs are during this episode until the very end, if you're okay with that.
That's fair.
That's a great exercise.
Because I think one of the things that's interesting about this is you guys are in the heart of Texas. It's about as blue as it gets in downtown Austin, but it's surrounded by this gigantic red ocean. And so it's kind of interesting that you guys have to play this interesting political game where you might have to be talking to one person one day and have a completely different opinion on what needs to get passed from a lobbying perspective the very next day. Am I wrong about that? Does that?
No, not at all. I mean, that's kind of the job. You know, I mean, our political preferences, our political affiliations are mostly irrelevant because, you know, the legislature is what it is, and the legislators there are who they are, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if there's, you know, 11 Republicans on a committee or 11 Democrats or split down the middle. You still have to get all the votes no matter what. So you have to go and make your case to everybody. So we pretty much leave our political affiliations out of it.
Yeah, and that's, you know, certainly harder to do in this day and age, in this environment.
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the things I'm surprised that this works. Because oftentimes I would just assume that someone would be putting a lot of pressure on you one way or another to say, no, go in and submarine that bill, like go make whole like our team. But you guys really do have to play both sides just to make things work at all in Texas.
I think it's a point of finding commonality. I think that's really what our job is in figuring out what motivates different legislators or these different office holders. And usually these issues, you know, drive the narrative for themselves, and it's our job to figure out how that narrative aligns with the legislature. To Andy's point, the deck's already set by the time where they're trying to influence the legislation. And so, and when I say deck, I mean the players. And so you know what they're involved, you know their preferences, you know what strokes them. And so it's really trying to try to align that based on what the client needs and how to push that priority forward.
Yeah, and usually we don't really talk party because, you know, in Texas the legislature they don't really make decisions most of the time off of party. It's because I mean that's DC, that's DC.
That doesn't jive with what most people's impression of Texas is.
Yeah, I know, and you know, DC does. I mean, you do not vote for something as a Democrat that's a Republican-led bill. You just don't. That's how they do it, right? So in Texas, it's not really that way all the time. It's more of a rural versus urban and suburban fight than it is party. And so we just have to go in and tailor our arguments about, a bill or a client to what they might care about. So it's going to be different if it's an urban legislator versus a rural legislator.
So for the audience, your job is to guess what these fellows believe without them telling you. So
I would say take an educated guess as to what they actually believe more than a guess. But yeah.
There's some alignment with the parties, no doubt. But I think, again, to some of the points that have been brought up already, these folks are, once they're in office and once they're not out on the trail, the agendas are kind of being set by our big three here in Texas: the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the House, and leadership, the de facto leadership. And so from there, we can get a good idea or a good sense of what's coming down the pike and what the discussion may look like. And then everything else is just a curveball. There's a lot of the stuff that just gets done on the fly, on the spot. Texas has a very unique process where we meet once every 2 years. And so it's 140 days. It's a crash course, very dynamic, very fast paced, but it's also by design. Some of that is to limit the type of legislation that gets passed to avoid bad policy, bad legislation being passed.
So can we talk a little bit about Salient just for a moment? Like when you guys first came to me, it was really about a very set, specific things that you wanted to go tackle, big technology type things. Could you talk a little bit about the areas that you guys want to be focused, just so we're talking about the same thing at the same time?
Sure. So, we work here in Austin. The capital is here in Austin, and Austin is a very dynamic workforce and a very dynamic environment when it comes to innovation. And we feel that for a very long time now, that those innovators at the Capitol have been very, not even misrepresented. They haven't even shown up. So we're out there trying to get the folks that are trying to be innovative in new technologies and new companies to come to us and come to the Capitol and bring their message of what they need to be successful to the folks that are making decisions without any sort of input from the folks that are being affected by these decisions.
Such as, though, give me some specifics. What industries are you most interested in?
I mean, we're looking at everything: cybersecurity, space, quantum computing even. We're really starting to look at what's going to be the policy discussions that are going to happen for the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Space. And
it's the emerging technologies, the innovations that right now don't have some sort of regulatory regime guiding them. Either, like they said, misrepresented, misguided, ill-informed, such a cutting edge technology that it's not understood by the normal policymaker or average citizen. And so to craft legislation and to ensure that the legislation that's being crafted is not stifling that industry's innovation and is also being conducive to some of the priorities that these legislators are discussing and trying to find, pulling on a lever around economic workforce, as Chris mentioned, right? Those are all things in this ecosystem that are very circular and 360. It's our job to make sure that all those pieces are aligned and are working in that kind of circular ecosystem.
Well, on the other side of that is that the three of us kind of hit on the three different big pots of money at the Capitol too. The three biggest drivers in the budget are healthcare, education, and transportation. And we have that collective background to kind of knock out all three of those.
So even if it's not high tech, that's still something you guys can handle, but your focus is mostly this cutting edge stuff because no one's really touching it.
Yeah, that's
exactly. Precisely.
It's a blue ocean ecosystem for you.
Yeah,
that's right.
Got it.
Untapped market for us.
Yeah, I could see that because I often see legislation getting passed that is just abysmal, and I can tell it has not been well lobbied. It's just someone on back a napkin sort of came up with something.
Sometimes not very well informed.
Right. Yeah. So I went through a civics class. You all just laugh.
Schoolhouse rock.
But it is exactly that bad. I feel like I was wildly misinformed about basically every single detail about how bills actually become real things. So I would like to spend a little time talking about a quick story before I go into this, but I'd like to get your take on how laws really get done in Texas. and right. But then before that, I was watching something this one time. It was like this, KNV2 or something coming to you straight from Oklahoma or wherever this place was that this was happening. It was this undercover thing where they had gotten these journalists to wear these wires, and they went into this Hilton somewhere or something, and they found all these senators or whatever, state congressmen or whatever, just kind of hanging out, just kind of randomly all met up somewhere one day. And then they there was police presence there for some reason, but they weren't allowed to go in, but there wasn't enough limits, but they weren't going to arrest them, but they weren't allowed to come in. And it was sort of this big ballroom where a bunch of people came in. I'm assuming lobbyists, but that was never made clear. And they asked them, what are you doing here? And they're like, oh, we're just here on vacation. Like, oh, all of you are on vacation at the Hilton and this place all at the same time. And then later that evening, they picked up one of the guys at the bar. They had an attractive journalist who was kind of just hanging out by the bar randomly, asking him a bunch of questions, like, what are you doing here? I'm like, oh, we're meeting with the lobbyists. They're the ones who write the bill, and we basically make this happen. And I was talking to another friend of mine about this exact topic. He's like, that is pretty much, I mean, that could have been Texas. It sounds like it wasn't Texas because it wasn't, but it might as well have been that way. How far off is that? And give me the steps that really happen.
We have to work in this industry.
I was going to say, he's trying to get us in trouble.
So,
go ahead.
So I would say, back to your previous point, Schoolhouse Rock's a bunch of bullshit. If I wanted to tell you the real process of how how to pass a bill at the Capitol,
sure,
I would really need a 3-dimensional, maybe even 4-dimensional holographic display to kind of actually show.
It takes time to
to show where all the inputs are and to where every bill can fail along this process. And that is what the process is actually designed to do. It's designed to kill legislation, not pass legislation. So where we come in as legislative professionals is to understand the inputs of that process that aren't actually on paper and aren't really spoken of. It's the things like the personal relationships between the members themselves. It's the partisanship, and by that I don't mean Republican versus Democrat. I mean Houston versus Dallas, or rural versus urban. Then the policy itself actually comes in maybe towards the end of these inputs of how to get a bill passed. If you have the greatest idea in the world, and you have a member carry it who's the best member in the world to carry this bill, but it goes to a committee where they've pissed off that chairman for some reason. Maybe they didn't show up to a birthday happy hour or something, and that has happened before. That bill's dead.
Sounds like there's a story there.
Yeah, that bill's dead, and it's none of your work that's gone into killing that bill. It's just the personal relationships that go into passing that bill are just wrong. So there's a lot of that happens.
Outlier of the process, or unintended consequences sometimes of it. Another, I think, good factor about what our work does, too, is understanding the political process, the inside baseball, and understanding the governance, the accountability, the constitution.
Such as what? Give me an example.
Ethics attorney, go ahead and step in.
I mean, I would say that about 10% of what you read in the news is the whole story, especially around the Capitol. Everything that happens is behind the scenes. For instance, the Texas Senate, for instance, they come in, and if you're in there, you're watching it on TV, you're watching it on the live stream, or you're in the gallery watching it, it looks like they're not doing anything at any given time.
They've already made up their mind?
They've already made up their mind. Everything is predetermined. They go in, they vote. On the rare occasions, they have the kind of big flashpoint bills. They have.
We're all living in a simulation right now.
The Wendy Davis stand up and filibuster for however many hours kind of moments, all that. But generally speaking, it's all done ahead of time. And sometimes they just come in and they read off votes and nobody's even there. And it's because they've all done it behind the scenes. So, you hear something, you see something, you read it on the news, you read it in the newspaper. That's not the whole story. It just isn't, because there are, like Chris said, there are flashpoints that happen behind the scenes. There are personal feelings that get hurt. There are, a
lot of horse trading, I would imagine.
Very much.
Absolutely.
A lot of horse trading, a lot of, I see some people say, well, it sounds like it's high school. It's more like middle school. It's very much like middle school over there. It's a lot of people getting butthurt over things that people say, and that's just how it is. I mean, it's our job to navigate that, to figure out the personal relationships, to figure out what makes these people tick, and make it so that it's not even an educated guess, that it's more of we've done the research, we figured out who these people are, we've figured out what makes them tick, and
say with certainty,
and where we can kind of pull on heartstrings or whatever.
So there has to be situations where there is the positive, like there is the true believer, but they're actually good, solid human beings. They're not just out there trying to, steal whatever they can steal. I'm imagining there's sort of both, and you probably know which ones are which, I would imagine.
I would say I've probably only met a few in the time that I've been around that is actually legitimately bad. most of the people up there, especially the staffers. The staffers are
That would make sense.
legit.
Because they're really doing it for nothing almost.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they are working their asses off. And I mean, look, we were all former staffers, so
Sure. Yeah.
Bit biased.
yeah, super biased.
Yeah.
They deserve more money.
Yeah, but most of those legislators go in there and they're there for the reasons that they say they're there for. Shit happens along the line, and they take hard votes, and they get put in bad positions, and they get their statements or their votes or whatever twisted by whoever, especially people that want to do them harm, and they come out looking like a terrible person. But most of them aren't. I mean, most of them are really good people.
Yeah, that's the thing that we don't really keep in mind for a lot of this thing is that these are people that we're talking about. They have the same shortcomings that I'm sure we all have in this room. And
Not me, of course.
of course, not Robert, of course, excluded in this. But for the most part, we're human. We have the same human pitfalls that everyone kind of falls into. But that's part of the process, and it's kind of how to navigate that process and navigate those pitfalls that really lends yourself to success at the Capitol.
Yeah, and it's a very dehumanizing process to run for office and be elected, because all you do is get shit on.
Well, and
all
also
the time.
you have to make every promise that has to be made, and those can be really conflicting promises.
It's in the public eye, and in the age of information right now, it's a lot easier for your constituent base or someone who's in opposition of an issue to feel empowered, to voice their opinion. And so, yeah, those bad actors exist, but I think genuinely, on the whole, people are there to do good service. Legislators are making $600 a year, $600 a month. It's a nominal salary,
What?
Yeah, so $600 a month
In Texas, at least,
In
not
Texas.
Congress.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I do want to have a little soapbox moment as well about lobbyists and like I said, legislative staffers, because it's also really dehumanizing for us.
I can imagine.
It's
got to be a lot like sales in general. I would
Yeah, I
imagine.
mean it's a joke, and I do it to kind of break the ice a lot of the time in the intro of two most hated professions in the U.S. and whatever. But yeah, we get shit on a lot.
I bet.
Because everybody assumes we're all with big tobacco and big oil or whatever.
Got bags of money walking around.
Yeah, and we're bribing everybody and all that, and it's not. I mean,
that meme that you pulled up in our presentations is one thinks that I beat a baby seal. One thinks that we're out just whining and dining and spending money.
So change the audience's opinion. You have a few minutes to do it.
Great. No, I got it locked.
Okay.
So imagine, I use this a lot in my presentations. Imagine you got elected tomorrow to city council, and in the next 2 weeks, you had to make big decisions on the police budget, stuff going on with Black Lives Matter, the water infrastructure and the water table, and I don't know,
35
what else?
sucks.
And,
I hate driving
traffic.
my commute.
Yeah, and traffic.
Let's throw that in there.
homelessness.
Yeah, and homelessness.
Right.
You've got your expertise, and it's not in any of those things.
Yeah, I'm probably a car dealer or something.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
Or you can
And-
literally use your background for this instance, to be honest.
So
with
let's
you.
not do that.
Yeah. and
That might actually open up some more doors for you.
and obviously you can hire staff.
Sure.
And that staff goes a long way, and we learn as staff as we go, and we learn as much as we possibly can, but there are limits. And especially in these big offices, you specialize. I'm the water person. I'm the water and the transportation person. Okay, cool. Well, but what about homelessness? What about the police force budget? What about the budget overall? They just can't learn everything all at once at all times and have an informed opinion to make an informed vote.
And so you're saying that that's what you provide.
It's one of the value adds. It's not just what we provide, but it's definitely a value add. And again, it's understanding that inside process and being able to speed that up and condense it down to help you assimilate to your on-the-job training. How many bills thousands of bills get brought before the legislature each and every session, and only several hundred are passing, right? And so there's a huge weed out process, but those members still have to vote either at the committee stage or at some point when it's come up in front of them. They have to make a decision on those particular measures. And so having either a lobby team or a well-equipped staff or both to help inform you on the issue and drive the conversation, and also separate fact from fiction, because there's a lot of that going around, a lot of that misinformation. it's an integral part of the cog in the machine, to be quite honest with you.
So, devil's advocate, have you guys ever met a law or that you just didn't like? Has it ever crossed your table? You're like,
Well, I thought we weren't going to get into parties before the end of this there, Robert.
I didn't ask which the law was, but have you?
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
You know, even as a former staffer, there were bills that my bosses would be voting for that I may not necessarily agree on personally, but it is my job to serve the people of that district that I'm representing in that office, and to think how they would think, and how would they think on a bill like this. And even though it might be different from what I'm thinking, it's my job to be the professional and to provide the most relevant information to the member that I'm working for at that time. And that goes into the lobby realm as well. Your job is to educate and to provide the most relevant information to the folks who are making those decisions. And that's really a large part of what we do, is quite frankly just educating folks on issues they're not having any sort of experience.
But if your ethics say that this is going to hurt a lot of people, do you get to say, I'm not gonna help you with this one?
Now, having said that, if the check clears and it's not something that is illegal or something that I would feel would be absolutely morally 100% reprehensible, we can have that conversation.
Well, and we had that conversation between the three of us of the types of clients that we would not take.
Okay. So there is some cohort.
There definitely are some that are, honestly, I mean, either morally or just political landmines that we don't want to tie ourselves on either side.
The brand of our
on
own
either
brand.
side. Yeah.
Why get involved if it's going to create some sort of polarization to the Salient brand, right? It's easier to avoid it.
Yeah, sorry. The big social topics, especially.
So you guys want to stay away from the far right, far left, and stay more center, it sounds like.
In some ways, but in other ways too. To Chris's point, we're a hired gun. We're paid advocates, right? And so to us, it's agnostic in that sense. I'm able, and I think that's why we're professionals. We're able to separate our personal ideologies and philosophies to that of what our clients' needs are, or our prospective clients, and marry ourselves to that. That's our job. That's what we get paid to do. We're supposed to be nimble and flexible and dynamic in that sense.
Yeah, there's a lot more to be gained from economic and business interests, and a lot more bills that pass on business issues than any of these fringe social issues
that tend not to hurt anybody in the process.
Yeah.
Interesting. So how does this differ from other states? Are you seeing that this is pretty much how it works everywhere? Do you talk to other lobbyists in other states?
We do. Yeah. So part of what we've done very intentionally and by design is create a hub and spoke. Texas is our bread and butter, is the policy area that we know the best, and but we also recognize that Texas is not limited in the businesses that it's bringing, and that there's transactions taking place in all sorts of markets. And so a couple of years ago, we decided to start networking and creating strategic partnerships. And so we've grown to about 30 plus different states right now, where we've got folks just like us, strategic partners, that can help be turnkey and give us the localized understanding of what the market is, what the factors are in that market, and how they might impact prospective clients. What we've also seen within that network is a cross-pollinating of our own clients, where we have a need here in Texas that resonates in Florida and that of Minnesota and of New York. We're able to kind of triangulate that and help provide a value add for our client, again, by having a turnkey network available, by giving them access to top-level decision makers, by mitigating barriers to entry in those particular markets.
And one of the interesting things that we found in our research from the 50 states is that, one, Texas is one of only 2 states in the nation that has a biennial legislature. So they only come in once every 2 years.
Everybody else is annually?
Everybody else is either annually or all year,
with
every
breaks in
year,
between.
with some breaks, or they show up every single year for a certain amount of time. Texas doesn't do that. Or they do a like a subject area session, and then they do a budget session the next time around. Texas only comes in for 6 months of every 2 years.
But sorry, I think to your point, though, in being able to understand those different markets and those different legislatures, there is a little bit of modeling that takes place, and you're able to also see what some of the priorities that states that have an apple-to-apple comparison, or even an apple-to-orange comparison that's representative of Texas. We're able to analyze that and, again, make some better informed decisions for either our firm or our clients or the market down here in Texas, and say, hey, priorities that are going on in Florida right now are likely to resonate very similar here to Texas, given the kind of makeup of our legislature. And so we can kind of hone in on that and try to make more.
Copycat laws. You can make friends in other states and say, if we band together, this might pass or whatever.
And that's something that's really popped up in the past couple of years, is legislation that you would see on, say, kind of the fringes of both parties is starting to matriculate its way across the country. So bills you would see filed in Florida that pass, you might probably see them in Texas pass because there's a bit of a inter-party rivalry, let's say, between the two governors of both states and positioning them as to who's the most conservative governor in the country, which might play itself down the road in certain presidential elections.
Of course.
So you're starting to see that pop up more where Texas is very unique, but the legislation and the issues that we're starting to see are resonating in other states at the same time.
Very interesting. So let's walk through a sample law and walk me through how this might happen. So this is something I talked to you guys about at one point. Let's say I want to have a little tiny piece of legislation that says those 30.6, 30.7 placards that are outside bars, for instance. Let's have something where that anytime that's present, it has to go into a registry somewhere. So someone is tracking that these things exist. And you have a small charge to have that thing there and to put yourself in the registry. That money goes to police officers who have to patrol the area because clearly no one with a gun is there other than the police. So, fund the police appropriately for however many of these bars exist in any given region. Let's say I like that law. Let's say I want to get that one passed. What do you think would be the process of making that happen?
Yeah, I'm going through the same checklist that Andy's probably going through. So you've got your built-in constituency in the bill. It's going to benefit police. In this environment in Texas, that's a very hard thing to say no to. At the same time, it's also going to help gun owners in Texas, which in a state like Texas is a very big constituency. So you have some built-in groups that you can look to for having internal support. You know that they're going to be there. They can contact their members. They're going to be there to show up and testify on that bill. So that puts us a little further ahead in getting a bill like that passed. Now, I would also look and see who would actually come out and be against a bill like this. Well, I could probably think maybe some of the business owners would be who would not necessarily want the extra step of registering with the state. Some of the other anti-gun groups would be out there saying this is going to be keep businesses from putting out 30.6 and 30.7 signs. So I'm checking the box to see who would be out there, who are the players, where the pitfall is going to be from a 30,000-foot level. So that is a very interesting thought conversation to have here.
Yeah, I mean, I would look at the like municipal league, cities, counties, see what they would have to say about it. If you could.
So it's a bit of a fact-finding mission.
Just kind of thinking about who all the stakeholders would be in the situation in each side, and okay, well, if the city, go to the cities and counties and the big cities and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think? Oh, no, we can't do that, blah, 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 blah. Okay, cool. What if we cut a percentage of each fee? The big one goes to DPS or police force or whatever.
Sure.
And a percentage of each one goes to your city, within your city limits. Oh, well, now they're on board, and then it's figuring out who the right sponsor is for that legislation, who's the right person, not just the person or the person that wants it, but who's the right person.
That's key.
That maybe
absolutely.
And what
key.
does that typically look like?
It's
somebody in seniority, somebody in power. Like on the House side, that would be somebody that is a lieutenant of the Speaker, who has a chair of a relevant committee. So I would assume that would go to like a public safety,
committee. Homeland Security, something like that.
So you try to get the chair of that committee to carry it first, if nothing else, then to kiss the ring, and then go from there, and then start whipping votes and make sure people are on board. But you start pulling up research and pulling up, creating one-pagers with data and facts on.
A lot of educating and informing for sure.
Yeah,
you got to hit all 200 offices there at the Capitol, right?
Yeah,
and make sure that they're well informed.
This is going to drive crime down by X percent, and here's a bunch of research from Pew on what this is going to mean and what it's going to do and all that, and just winning hearts and minds essentially at that point.
Yeah, they often, oftentimes the data that's empirically backed helps drive the conversation. It's easy to kind of point to, and when you've got fact to support your argument, and so a lot of that due diligence that Andy's talking about is done on the front end, and what he's describing is how that legislation is formed, in anticipation of that legislative session or during session and ongoing. But oftentimes when you look at the Texas cycle, it's 2 years, right? And there's 18 months of developing these stakeholder relationships, creating that on-ramp, because when they're here in January, every other odd year, it's a fast-paced environment, as I was saying here at the outset. And so
how long does that typically take? Is this I can do it in one session, no problem? Is it?
It's usually incremental change. You usually take 2 or 3 sessions to pass a bill, to be quite honest, here in Texas. And again, it's part of by design, unless Andy will come to his macabre saying here in a second. That's why I already know I'm getting the blue steel look. So it's very incremental change and very slow. And again, that's by design. It's intentional. It's the way it's been set up and designed and structured to do.
To limit the amount of laws in Texas.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and my macabre saying, as Dustin said, my macabre saying is nothing happens quickly at the Texas Capitol unless a lot of people die or a lot of people go to jail. Otherwise, it's going to take a while. It's incremental change. You move the ball forward. It may not be everything you want, but it's probably more than you deserve. And just keep chipping away at it.
And there's also just, there's luck and coincidence and happenstance that also plays right into the process. There's plenty of priorities that we've seen on the table for the last decade that did not move until a global pandemic hit the Texas Capitol and really just kind of shook shit up and flipped it upside down and really gave attention to some of these new technology innovations that we're talking about that really didn't have a voice there previously. When we all switched into this hybrid world or this digital world, you saw, education's my background and forte. You saw learning management solution companies coming out of the woodworks and helping actually survive and keep education on level, equitable, and on the same playing field, and not having to miss, we missed some steps, but without having to miss as many as we would have had it not been there to replace it. And, there's been lobbyists and there's been folks advocating for this technology change for decades now, and it took a global pandemic to make that shift. And so sometimes it's just good luck, good fortune, good timing. Other times it's having a team like us of rock stars and experts that can get shit done.
Of course. So how do you aim for bipartisan support? How do you craft it, or how do you craft your message, I guess, to get that sort of more broad appeal as opposed to just tackling one?
One of our exercises is a podcast just like this. I mean, it's personal privilege, another selfish plug for us, I guess. You can find us on YouTube. But it's what Chris had mentioned earlier. We're all humans at the end of the day. We, there's a humanistic element to being a legislator, and we personally at the firm try and find those strokes or those elements of folks to tap into and understand them for who they are. And we find that is very successful in creating value for our clientele, to be quite honest.
Yeah, it's finding, like Dustin said, the commonalities that we all have. We all have families. We all have, if we have kids, we all have an interest in seeing those kids grow up and be as successful as they can. And a lot of the members do too. It's funny when you look at them as people, they are just like any other person you see on the street. And having a conversation with them is outside then at that point politics. It's just having a conversation with someone that you might have an interest with and trying to find enough commonality to get something passed at the Capitol. So
it isn't a matter of crafting it to their particular political beliefs. You're just meeting them where they are as a human.
Exactly right. I mean, if there's one particular office where, I can walk in and I can talk pro wrestling with the member. That's something that most of the general public doesn't know, but it's a way to have that commonality in something that is outside the building. And, oh, by the way, Representative, while we're here, can I talk to you about this bill?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there is a certain amount of not only meeting them where they are on a personal level and getting to know them and having that, I mean, because our whole business is relationships to begin with. So
and trust.
Somehow we get paid to make friends with people.
Me too, actually.
But, also when it rubber really hits the road, we've still got to craft our message to what is going to resonate with that particular person. So, I mean, the exact same bill, we can craft that message very differently depending on what the legislator's political point of view is.
How palatable it will be. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely some curating, there's some fine tuning and articulating that language to some of what you were driving with your question. And so that's also part of the work of legislative writing and that crafting. And that's a skill, and that's an art form that is very intentional, and very few people, harness or represent that type of quality. And it's a special skill set, and be able to kind of craft and create laws on your own is a value add to these clients, especially when they don't know how to, again, navigate that realm. Legalese, even in and of itself is sometimes hard for folks to kind of understand. And so having someone there to represent you in that sense, I think it goes a long way for them.
Well, for instance, if we came in with a, legalizing marijuana bill, we would craft the
cannabis to
pitch.
Be politically correct.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. We would craft the pitch to a certain office very differently depending on what office we're talking to, right? So if we went into a staunch far right Republican office, we already kind of know we're up against a wall on that, and so we would probably craft it as business economic impact,
Personal freedom,
all that kind of stuff.
Agriculture, farming, was something
Exactly.
that's driving their constituent base, something that that's hitting back into their local economy. And how does that industry or this policy that you're trying to craft impact that one particular member? And so before the Farm Bill passed on cannabis in 2017, we wouldn't have been able to have that conversation with a rural conservative. But back to your point about incremental change in these laws, the placeholder was put in place in 2017 that allowed hemp to be sold and used in products here in Texas, And so that was the stepping stone, right? And now that's going to seed hopefully more reform and more change around the medicinal space or adult use. And so it took that one placeholder to get in play to allow the conversation to further the agenda down the road.
Yeah, but we wouldn't take a business and personal freedom tactic to a super liberal member either. We'd go getting people out of prison and not putting people in prison for small marijuana amount stuff, that sort of thing.
We'll get back to this because I actually want to talk about that as a sort of separate point. But one thing that I think is worrying to some people that I've talked to about lobbyists as a profession is what happens when a criminal organization decides, hey, we need these laws passed. Like once upon a time, I was at a security conference and sort of off the record sort of conference, and there was like a no joke. We should get one of us elected to an office and start passing pro-privacy bills that allow us to stay under the radar and create more botnets and blah blah blah. And this wasn't like a kind of a passing thought. This was like, okay, which one of us is going to be? And it started getting much further along than you might expect, to the point where, campaign slogans were starting to be banded around. It didn't end up happening. This actually did not occur, but close enough that it really kind of worried me. And then when I saw something like Mitch McConnell, he had some relatives who had a ship that had like 90 pounds of cocaine on it or whatever. It makes a lot of sense that he might be pro drug regulation or whatever, because that drives up the price of cocaine, and then that 90 pounds is worth more as opposed to less. I'm not accusing him of actually having done that, but you can see how easy it would be to go down that path. Are you guys hearing any wind of that, or is that an ethical issue that you've ever kind of run up against or thought about? Or
I mean, I've never personally run up against something like that. You always hear whispers, or you always hear, hey, here's the real reason why someone had a piece of legislation, because they had a personal interest in seeing that legislation passed. That does happen. Again, that goes back to the point of these are people that we're talking about, and some people at least, when given the opportunity to benefit themselves at the expense of others, will take that. It is a part of the process. It's an unfortunate part of the process, but it is not a widespread, I would say, issue or widespread, sort of circumstance that you run up against. But to say that it doesn't exist would be very naive, especially on our part.
It seems like in my world, there's something called a software bill of goods. It's like, here's what is made up of, there's all the parts that make up this thing, this operating system or this piece of code or whatever, all the libraries, who made them, where they came from. It seems like one of the things that's missing is sort of like a legal bill of goods. Like, where did this come from? Who created this piece of legislation for real? I'm not saying who sponsored it. I'm saying, where did this really come from? Do you guys feel like
I would push back? Isn't our legal bill of goods the Bill of Rights and Constitution? I mean, to me, that drives a lot of how I operate as a lobbyist, and sometimes in my conviction and seeing how the laws are. I mean, to me, that's part of what government's job is to do, is to set that framework and to set that regulation in many ways. Obviously, there's going to be pulls and takes on that in different directions. But to me, those are guiding documents, guiding principles for a reason, and they help really guide a lot of my principles. Obviously,
yeah, but you might be wildly more ethical than the bad guy, right? So we have to account for both.
But I think, again, when that bad guy's outlier in the political process, and so I think there's more good than there is evil. And
but how do we know that if without a software bill of goods for legislation? How do we know if I don't know that it's this guy who's clearly cartel is putting this thing forward? How do we know?
There's circuit breakers.
I mean, you mentioned the cartels. I'll go one step further, and as far as evil organizations, homeowners associations. There was a former state senator who managed homeowners associations, and his legislation every year was dealing with homeowners associations. Now, you could say on one hand he has the background knowledge of how these HOAs actually operate and the business side of that.
Sure.
but they were grossly pushing the level of power towards favoring HOAs over actual homeowners. That is, I would say, an example of people actually using the process for personal gain. He's no longer a state senator, so I can actually say that story, but everybody knew this bill was coming from the HOAs themselves through a person they have elected to carry their legislation. And it happens across every industry you can think of. You know, doctors get elected by other doctors to carry legislation for doctors to benefit their medical practices. So it happens across every industry, whether it's nefarious or not. That remains to be seen as the process plays out, but it does happen.
It doesn't make for good PR or press either, right? And so I think that too is also just a natural weed out or a mechanism that exists in the process that cuts it off before it gets too far along or before that person cedes too much power. And ultimately, you know, you trying to come in as a legislature thinking that you're going to carry your agenda, the fact of that reality actually coming to play, very few people actually come in with their direct agendas and get everything accomplished, right? That takes years to build up that type of credibility and power within leadership to be able to say that I'm going to do that. And so to say that it doesn't exist wouldn't make sense, but I think that it's very, very minimal and very outlier from what I've seen.
I mean, I would take it a step further and say that it's impossible what you're requesting here.
Interesting.
Just because, I mean, like, think about, what everybody calls dark money. That has been expanded since 2010, basically. Citizens United. Corporations are people, and they can dump money into races and all that, and hide the 8 ball, and
at least we would know it's a company somewhere,
right? But the problem is when it's a particular person that then funnels it through a corporation, that then funnels it through a political action committee, that then, I mean, I could write it and hand it to Chris, hand it to Dustin, Dustin hands it to you, and it looks like it's from Dustin. And there's no way to know that my fingerprints were ever on it in terms of writing a bill. I mean, it's just impossible to track.
Yeah, understood. So another thing that I ran into, Richard Garria DeCayu he was an astronaut actually in town.
Ultima Online, right?
Yep, Ultima Online, exactly. He invited me to an event where one of Hillary's campaign managers was in town, and I really couldn't care at all about that. I was actually just there to meet him and hang out with him a little bit. So he was kind of sort of in the back of the room, and I was sort of in the front of the room, kind of right next to the speaker, and he spent a good 20 minutes sort of explaining what this whole thing about backdooring cryptography was about. And he got pretty heated. There was one other technical guy in the audience, which I was not expecting anyone technical to be there. But there's one other technical guy who's like, you can't do it, it's not possible. And he was kind of going back and forth. And he looked at me, this campaign staffer, and or I guess he was one of the chief of staff. And he said, you guys are the smart guys, you can figure it out. Well, I didn't believe it to be true, and then I went back to my lab and I figured it out. I figured out a way to do it, which has got to be one of the worst ideas I've ever come up with. But it's possible. I can actually do it. I know how to do it. I know how to do it in a way that's not absolutely terrible. But I don't think I would ever allow that to happen. This is one of those my personal ethics coming into play, because the problem is when the government gets a little bit too much visibility into what's going on, back to your comment about the drug situation, it basically doesn't allow anyone to ever try to break the law for the benefit of everybody, because there's a lot of laws that are very unjust, incredibly unjust. I think the drug laws have ended up. My favorite is congratulations to drugs for winning the war on drugs. Because I really do think it took a groundswell of people breaking the law for that to finally go, okay, there's room for change here.
Right.
The backdoor is a perfect example of where the government was trying, even Obama came to Austin trying to pitch this as an idea, and it did not land well, by the way. The audience did not give rousing applause to that part of the presentation. I think this is the kind of thing where enough people are going to push it anyway that you guys are going to be asked at some point, okay, we want this backdoor law. How are you going to stand in front of that freight train? How are you going to, or are you just going to say, cool, let's do this? Because this really could, what this does, this type of law does, is it freezes all laws in time.
You know what? I mean, my gut reaction is to let's go for it. Let the process play itself out. I mean, again, I believe in the design of the process that it would be weeded out if it wasn't good policy or it wasn't a good law in many ways. And to me, I would trust being able to kind of run it through that flagpole, or run it up that flagpole and through that particular process, and give it that shot.
You're saying that it would get killed en route.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, but
I think it probably would.
I'd say it would get killed, to begin with. For an issue like that, I could think of maybe one member that would even have a passing interest in something like this. But at the same time, every member gets to vote on something like that eventually if it makes it to the respective floors. So that's part of the challenge of how do you pass legislation when the actual understanding of what they're passing just doesn't exist.
And also giving that kind of power, let's say, to the state to have a backdoor.
It is a terrible idea.
They're not equipped.
It's a terrible idea, but it is, I could make that happen. And here's the problem is a guy like me I could actually write that piece of legislation, and I think people would look at it and go, yeah, it's probably reasonably okay, except for the ramifications of it. That's the part that's horrible. It's not the technical part. It's not could we do it and could we make it relatively safe? I think we can get past that part. I just don't think it's a good idea for us to freeze all laws in time. Like, I think one of the beautiful parts about this, I think all laws should probably have an expiration date on them, just to force everyone to renegotiate. Like, is this something we really want to re-up? Because there's so many laws out there that is very, very poorly written. And I think this is an example of that, where if I put this thing in place and I could backdoor and watch anybody who has any minor protest that some agency believes is going to overthrow some law, and that's law. I mean, that's law. Yeah. And so you're saying you're going to do something illegal here. I think that stifles innovation in a way that people just really have not grokked. Am I on crack here?
No, I think you're right. I mean, and again, that goes back to my point again, that government oftentimes is making decisions haphazardly and not knowing what those unintended consequences are, or those ramifications that you're speaking to.
Okay, this is a great segue. So what I think might be an interesting law, although I think it's very unlikely to ever pass, would be a unintended consequences rider, or a law on top of every law. So what it would be is every law has to be reviewed by sort of a dissenting party to say, well, we believe that these are. It could be just a similar. It could be the Office of Accountability Officer, OAG, I think is what it's called. Somebody like that, where they just say, okay, we believe here are the positive things that could happen, but here are all the negative things that could happen. And if any of those negative things start happening, it's a circuit breaker and says, okay, this law needs to go away after some time period, let's say a year or 2 years or something. And that way, we would always have some way to unwind laws that just had weird unintended consequences. Like, what do you think about that?
I mean, there's plenty of examples of laws getting passed that have far-reaching unintended consequences. One that I always talk about is when Illinois passed their anti-drone bill. It actually was written in a way where Google couldn't actually fly their satellites over the state of Illinois for Google Map images, because the way the language was written, it was way too prescriptive into what actually a drone would be. And that's kind of the balance of what we work on, is how do you create policy that is prescriptive enough to accomplish the goals of your clients, but not so prescriptive enough that it stifles innovation, particularly in the areas that we're working in. So that is something that
space being one of those as well,
especially for space. Yeah. We can get to that a little bit further, but back to your point of how do you get around the unintended consequences? I don't think you can, quite frankly.
You go back and readdress the bill in a future session. You go back and recognize that was the pitfall of it, and you readdress it.
But that requires somebody to have a pony in that race to bother to do that.
Perhaps.
And as you said, it might take 2 or 3 sessions. That's 6 years.
But I also think from what you've presented to us, to me, it screams unfunded mandate. What is the cost to the state? Yeah. What is it streamlining? What is it doing? What is the value add for going down this particular wormhole? And so
less legislation, ideally, or less bad legislation, I guess.
Ideally, but you're asking to unwind every legislation historically. Like, what type of man hours and staff time is going to be dedicated to go through that, or what type of system is it going to cost to have the software available to comb through legislation that is redundant and one that actually needs to be deserved, or one that's not up for a timeline.
I would say probably retroactive laws. We could leave those on for now.
But you see what I'm saying? Like, I'm one person with one opinion, and there's 180 other people that are going to look at it from a different perspective. Sure. And so that's the uphill battle that you have in getting that legislation passed.
We do have something that is kind of similar to what you're talking about. One of the best things that the state actually does in Texas is we have what's called the Sunset Advisory Commission. And they are a select group of 5 members from the House, 5 members from the Senate, and 2 members of the general public. And their goal is to look at every state agency on a rotating 12-year schedule and decide, is this state agency meeting their mission effectively and efficiently? And if they're not, they can make recommendations to reform that agency, or then go so far as to get rid of that agency completely. So we do have a little bit of a background here in Texas, or a backstop here in Texas, to look at what are some unintended consequences
For the agency specifically.
for the agency specifically. That's
And
right.
those were also, sorry, Andy.
Go ahead. That's all right.
And those were also put into play by bad actors, former agency heads that have misstepped and had forced new leadership coming up in the ranks to add more accountability, to add more governance, to ensure that these bad actors are going to be removed from office and are not going to be put back into that position.
Sure.
So 2 things on my end. One is that this sounds very similar to something that just got put in place a handful of years ago in the governor's office, where these state agencies, they come out with rules, they do rulemaking. They pass a bill, and then it most of the time requires these state agencies that oversee whatever to make some rules to further define what this is actually going to do in practice and all that.
Sure.
The governor's office now has its own little office within his office that reviews every single rule that comes out from a state agency to make sure that it's not anti-competitive. And so, and it'll kick it back to them and say, no, this is
Didn't meet muster.
this is anti-competitive, this is anti-FTC, we're not doing it. Go back and try it again.
Interesting.
So there's that. The other thing is that what this sounds like to me of what you're proposing
Sure.
is
I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah. No, for sure.
No, you're branded to it. This is yours now. Own it.
I call the legislature the front end of the law, where if we don't like a law, we don't have to go and sue over it. We just go make a new one or amend it or change it, which I like way better than being in the courtroom.
Sure.
But honestly, if it's an unintended consequence, that's when you go to court. I mean, that is not a satisfactory answer
It
to
is
you,
not
I know.
at all. Yeah.
But that's what I mean. That's the other branch,
And that's where the Attorney General's office comes in. They can provide clarification through an opinion or what have you. But
Yeah, I've seen a
And
lot
then
of
you
their
got executive
opinions
agency on the rulemaking side too, where there's another stop in the process to influence that change as well if you don't like that unintended consequence. So again, that's part of the checks and balances that was again there by design, by original intent. Is it perfect by any means? Absolutely not. But again, it's there. There's a foundation for us to follow. There's guidance. There's principles there.
So let's broaden it a little bit to the entire United States now, because I think this is going to hit home to more people. I mean, Texas is interesting, but I think this is a microcosm. So I think in general we have this weird thing happening where we have taken this very tiny commerce clause and turned it into this massive wedge that allows every random thing to be called commerce, even if it has nothing at all to do with commerce. Just someone visiting their grandma or whatever. Commerce. Like, how is that commerce? So who's spending money on doing that? It's just they're walking 10 feet across a border, and suddenly that's somehow commerce. So first of all, do you guys have any opinions on these commerce clause and this gigantic wedge? Like, how did we go from commerce clause to the TSA?
So I'm going to give my partisanship away here pretty
I was
clearly.
going to say this might be the question that blows the partisanship thing open.
The Commerce Clause is the biggest sham perpetrated on the American public that they don't know about, or most of them don't know about, or are not aware about how it impacts their lives on a day-to-day basis. It's bullshit, quite frankly. If that doesn't give it away to your viewers, I don't know what will. But the Commerce Clause, I would say, is one of the largest tools for government overreach that we've seen in my lifetime, at least. What they've been able to come in and what the federal government's been able to claim as an inherited power because of the Commerce Clause is shocking to most. Should be shocking.
Do you
to
know
most
the time frame that happened, where that started getting that wedge?
I mean, you're going back to the 1700s with the initial passage of the Commerce Clause.
I mean, when it started being used in this way, it seems like it's a fairly relatively new thing, right?
20 years-ish.
It's grown, but I would say even going back to the initial passage of the Commerce Clause, it's been used to kind of consolidate power into
Colonies,
into the federal government.
Go ahead. I'll play that leg of the stool here.
All right. I mean, how do I do this without giving it away?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, aside from Commerce Clause specifically,
Sure.
I would say, a lot of this goes back to, what people want to call original intent of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all that. It's like, freedom of speech does not mean I can say whatever I want to you, or that you can't stop me from saying something I want to say. It means that the government can't tell you that you can't say it.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And a lot of this stuff I feel like has been perverted over time.
Will Smith made his point very clear the other night.
Yeah.
So that is a form of censorship, despite the fact that it is not government-sponsored censorship.
Right, but it's also not First Amendment.
Sure, agreed. It isn't.
And people just, I don't know, man, like, I don't want to go too far down the, like, we're in idiocracy now, but, like...
This is the second time that's come up on this show in
Jesus,
just a couple of weeks.
I mean, just, I don't know, people just...
Nitpicky,
and they're just not, they're not well informed, or they don't care, or it's very selfish me kind of thing or something. But, I mean, I feel like a lot of these constitutional amendments have been blown way far off from what the original actual intent was. I do not want to get started.
Commerce Clause is just another one. Is that what
it's
just
your
point?
Cycling through the amendments at this point and figuring out what is ripe and palatable for discussion. You could pick any particular amendment or go through any particular one in the Constitution, and I think have conversations about it. And so, to the point, I don't know, we're 400 years removed from the original signing of that document. Do you take into consideration the timing, the changes that have happened in our history and our society, and go back and readjust to your point here about the legislation that you mentioned a second ago? Like
400 years?
300 years? I don't know. My math might be off. Something like that.
We do this because we're not math majors.
You guys nodded. I'm like, wait.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, whatever. But point still stands in some way that, old antiquated laws in some sense maybe need to be revisited and have a debate around them again. And so in that sense, I can appreciate the sense of revisiting these topics, but I also don't want to get too far away from, again, the foundation of what created this country and what allowed us to turn into the state that we are today, to be quite honest with you.
I mean, Texas is the 9th largest economy in the world. And without the Commerce Clause, I personally believe that we could be a little further up. What regulations that the federal government's placed on the state of Texas that we could, if for internal purposes only here in the state, exploit or profit on. There's a lot of stuff out there that we could be doing, but without federal regulation, we couldn't. So it's a very interesting dynamic to see that I would say the state's actually being held back a little bit. By
the way the energy industry here in Texas has pushed back against the APA and sued them for the last decade. I mean, AGs forever just sending something back and forth to them, because it's stifling that industry right now, and that's a huge impact here in Texas.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of times that the Texas legislature has bandied around the idea of like kicking the TSA out of Texas, for instance, and then the federal government says, well, if you do that, then no airplanes ever land in Texas, kind of thing. So,
right.
I mean, they're using this as a pretty enormous wedge to put in whatever they want, anywhere they want, which, sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it may not be good at all.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes it's just kind of what happens in a globalized world. I mean, and I hate to go into Russia and everything, but like we're finding out very damn fast, and so is Russia, how everybody is connected through trade agreements and, reliance on exports and imports and that sort of thing. I mean, one thing can cascade all the way across. And I mean, yeah, it sucks. TSA sucks. We don't like it, but I like I like flying more than I hate TSA, But
they also aren't police officers, which is even the weirder thing. So we've given civilians the ability to do all kinds of terrible things.
Just
unreasonable
9/11,
search and seizure.
9/11, 9/11, 9/11.
Yeah, that was interesting. I remember. I think I remember that day better than a lot of people, because a lot of people, they kind of like, well, like, how do we end up here? And I'm like, well, everyone was screaming for legislation. Everyone was. And I remember thinking, I don't know that what you're asking for is well thought out, but, I'm just one voice amongst a
That's how we ended up with the Patriot Act, too.
That's how we ended up at war as well. The wrong kind of war as well in some ways. But
something I preach at home with my family and kids, and we practice here at the office, is removing the emotion from the argument. And I don't think that happens often enough, in a lot of these conversations.
There was a lot of soccer moms who wanted to go to war that day. And I think that's what happened. That's how we are now having people touching our junk when we go through airport security.
We're seeing the mama bears do it in our schools right now, and
Yeah, I was
around
gonna say
mask
school
mandates
board.
and school boards and such like
Well,
that.
I'm glad you guys mentioned schools here. So I have a little pop quiz for you guys. Hope you guys like
Are you
quizzes.
smarter than a Texas third grader?
Well, yeah, we'll see here.
Kind of.
So feel free to take a gander and pass around as you see fit. So the USDA had a food pyramid once upon a time. You guys are probably old enough to remember that, as I did. They got rid of that in 2005 and replaced it with something called the MyPyramid, which I was thinking as part of this, it would be interesting to talk about more widespread bizarre things coming from the federal government. But I found it even weirder than I thought as I went down the rabbit hole, which is typically how this happens because no one ever does the research. But so this is a full replacement for the food pyramid, which was, as you guys probably remember, actual pyramid where
Right.
there's blocks and it was on top of the block. This is more like raised to space sort of vibe going on for those who can't see it. Colorful thing. So I don't know if you wanna go first here. Which of the rays do you believe is the largest? If you were to guess.
This is some optical illusion.
No, just which one do you think is largest?
Like which one is recommended to have the most of?
Yeah, which one do you think you should be eating the most of per day based on that?
I would say vegetables or grains.
So by weight, grains are 6 ounces, veggies are 6.2 ounces, fruits are 5 ounces, milk is 24 ounces.
Jesus.
And
Big milk coming in strong.
I got a good lobby.
meat and beans are 5.5 ounces. So
Did you say Frankenbeans? Oh, you said meat and beans.
meat and beans are 5.5 ounces. So does that feel like the right disparity just visually, just taking a look at that thing?
Probably not.
Or does that even look close to
Yeah, I
you
would say
guys?
that's not the scale.
I saw something on Twitter or Instagram or something the other day about this in particular, and saying, back in the 80s, Big Milk convinced all of our parents that we need to be drinking gallons and gallons a day, or
we'll
else our
get-
bones were going to turn to dust.
We'll get to milk in a second. So on this, which is a supplemental document, the second half of it, which you can take a look at as you feel free, it says eat at least 3 ounces of whole grain, and then below it says eat 6 ounces every day. So which is it? You have to
It
eat.
just hurt my brain there.
Very, very bizarre. Looking at the thing, where do you think the beans are on that? Take a look. I know the rays from space here. Where do you see the beans on there?
In the purple stride?
I mean, maybe that's a bean. It could be maybe a deer print or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
there are beans on there. This is
It's like Where's Waldo, but a shitty Where's Waldo. Oh, there they are. I see them. They're in the vegetables.
Okay, great. They're also
Wait,
under.
what?
Yeah.
They're in the vegetables?
But
That's
they're
weird.
also under the meat and beans category. So
the
beans
blue
are
and-
on there twice.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's the Morpheus red and blue pills.
Yes, yes, it looks like literal pills, like Tylenol or something. So how many times does milk appear on that? Things that recognizably are milk say they are milk.
Looks like 3.
3.
3 times on a single document. How much fruit juice should you have on this thing says go easy on fruit juices. So no explanation about how much, just go easy on them. And it says about 60 minutes a day of physical activity may be needed to prevent weight gain. However, children need to gain weight, otherwise they stay children, right? So there's sort of a not particularly well thought out idea on what weight is useful for as an adult. So this all got removed in 2011, and now it is replaced by this thing called MyPlate.
Oh, yeah. I've seen that.
Now, MyPlate is a much more simplified version of the same thing. There's only 5 categories: meat, vegetables, meat, beans, and vegetables, fruit, and dairy. Dairy is just like sitting off there to the side. Big old chunk of dairy hanging out. This was based on, there's a supplemental documented there, which I did not bother printing, which is a 164-page document that explains all the things you need to know and how to process this one icon right there. And you're thinking, okay, it's got to be better than this raise from space thing. Oh, no. No. It's exactly as bad as that, except it's now 164 pages filled with all kinds of bizarre things, largely about milk, about breastfeeding and how useful milk is and how dairy should be considered, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also other things. It never once mentions things like glycemic index. It never discusses the fact that tomatoes actually are not a vegetable. It puts them in the vegetable category instead of fruits. Same thing with yams. It messes that up as well. So there's all kinds of very large technical inaccuracies in this document, which has been revised at least twice in my lifetime by theoretically people who are supposed to do this thing for a living, right?
I just don't understand how you get 100 pages in and still mess up tomatoes. It mentions BMI many times. I think 5-6 times in the document. Usually is things you need to reference elsewhere outside the document, which is one of the most awful,
unbelievably terribly written pieces of technical thing. People are still focused on weight. They're like, I'm not losing weight. Well, that's because you're gaining muscle. So first of all, just looking at that, first of all, who do you think the audience for that document is?
I'm assuming it's my third grader.
Okay. The 164-page document as well?
I'm assuming just the little character, that image there.
Sure. That and the 64-page document. Who gets to read what? Who's that for?
I mean, I would say the infographic would be more towards children, and the actual 100 and whatever page document would be for the parents. But I would imagine not a lot of folks are out there taking the time to read a 160-page document on.
Yeah, I would say school personnel,
Leadership, health and PE, those departments.
Maybe nutritionists specifically.
So Stanford created their own version of the same document.
Oh my God.
One pager?
Also one pager, but this time it has things like oils on there.
Yeah.
Oils and salts, and instead of dairy, it has water. Which water is really not mentioned hardly at all
in that
164 doc. It is a couple times, but nowhere near as much as milk. Milk is, many, many, many times. I think it's more than 5 times more times. So my opinion is this is certainly meant for teachers to teach children how to eat, right? And the unfortunate part is this is actually being used by schools. So they're saying, well, you have to have one of each thing or whatever. And they're coming up with these dietary things. So this is a local elementary school. This is their Friday breakfast. And now they get to choose options, but you have to choose a certain amount of options and you only get one from each category. So it is possible for a breakfast for a young child to have for breakfast a glazed donut, orange juice, and chocolate skim milk. That is their nutritious breakfast that, if you actually read their guidelines, actually makes a lot of sense. So this isn't just staying in its tiny little, like, here's how teachers are teaching children sort of world. This is trickling down to millions of American children. And of course, their parents being told from their kids, oh, I need to have this and that. And they're sort of learning it from their kids. Or maybe occasionally they will read this 164-page document, or it gets translated and they get some digested version from some article somewhere. First of all, how did this thing come to be? If you were going to make this atrocity, how would you make this atrocity?
I think this goes back to kind of the unintended consequences conversation I had earlier. It started probably with good intentions of government trying to provide some sort of guideline to folks who may not know what a nutritious meal would actually look like, and then from there, one of the purposes I think of a lot of federal agencies these days is to just justify their existence and their continued existence. So you see them coming back and providing new guidelines and, we have new information, here's the new set of guidelines to follow. But that's a way to kind of keep themselves in business, quite frankly. So I think it started out as kind of beneficial guidelines, but from there it kind of morphed into its own mutant kind of what it looked like previously.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like the old dumb joke of, what do you get when you ask a committee to draw a horse? A camel. It's just Frankenstein crazy ass document, and these weird decisions of, and I mean, this breakfast menu is very similar to my son's breakfast menu.
I'm sure.
You know?
It probably is almost identical.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the brands are swapped out or something.
And it's funny, sorry, you know, I said earlier, you know, big milk, big dairy, whatever, but that honestly might not be that far off. You know, dairy farms in the U.S. are...
Corn industry?
Yeah, corn industry. I mean, you know, that it very well could have been a targeted lobby effort to ensure that the dairy industry has business going forward, to have the USDA recommend a certain amount of milk or dairy products to every kid in the U.S. I mean, that's a pretty damn effective and very targeted, specific way to ensure your business continues.
Genius.
I don't know if it's true, but...
I'd also like walk back, you know, you said it's been changed twice in your lifetime, right? And this is something that I know the three of us kind of grew up with, that food pyramid.
Sure.
It goes back to, again, the age of information. This wasn't, you know, that type of information wasn't disseminated readily. You couldn't get on the internet and do that fact finding and figure out what's locally sourced and what does that mean, how to get good nutritional value. And so, as Chris maybe said, you know, this was probably a good attempt by government to create that guidance, that document for parents and for school systems to help guide. And then there was probably some industry influence behind it as well. And, you know, with that, you get what was created, and then over time, you go back and revisit it, and you've got new influence, and you've got new priorities that get injected into it. But it's still a guiding document that's going to be served there, and that's part of what we mentioned here about the outset with our firm too, is looking at a lot of these antiquated laws and these systems and recognizing that government lags, and trying to see how we can help bridge those gaps with policy or with technology. Because oftentimes it's not government that's going to be the steward of it. It's going to be industry driving it. If they're not at the table, there's going to be these crazy ass laws that are getting passed.
I just wonder where the actual experts are, because an actual expert would take one look at any one of these documents and just shake their head and go, "Wait, hold on." And I am not an actual expert. I'm just some guy who did a little research, and I can find maybe 100 flaws with the 3 or 4 documents I showed you. How do we get actual experts in the room to actually take a look at these things and provide real feedback? I mean, I'm fine with a lobbyist being in the room. That's fine. And maybe that's how the legislation gets done. But is there a way to provide some actual technical feedback from somebody who knows what they're talking about?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I specifically tell clients and legislators too is, hey, look, I know you don't want to hear from me. I get that. I'm a hired gun. I'm not an expert on this. All I'm here to do is to get access to you for this person over here who is an expert. And so I don't want to be the one talking. I sure as hell don't want to be the one in a committee hearing testifying. I have no business being up there. We need the experts. You know, I get my nursing client in here to talk to you about this stuff. I don't want to have a one-on-one meeting. I can shoot the shit with you and be your friend and have a relationship and all that. But when it really comes down to it, I want to get my client in there to be the one to talk about it.
But if that's the case and it is big dairy, I mean, I'm not even saying you're wrong. I think you might even be right.
I don't
know. Based on what I saw, dairy had a lot of influence where it doesn't really make a ton of sense. But why is it always dairy's lobbyists with dairy's experts? Why isn't it dairy's lobbyists with experts? Just experts. How does that ever happen? Or just never happen?
Do those experts show up? I mean, do they have their own association? Do they have their own, you know, advocacy efforts? I'll give you a quote from my favorite president of all time. It's actually a fictional president. It's the President Bartlett from the show West Wing. He has a line in that show where he says, you know, decisions are made by those who show up. If you don't show up to be part of the process, you're going to get run over by the process. And if there are experts out there who have an expertise to lend to the people making decisions, they need to be involved in the process, quite frankly. And that's not, you know, me going out there and say, hey, hire a lobbyist. It's just show up, meet your local member, become an expert and a resource for them, because that is something they look for. They do look for the people that especially locally, have the expertise that they need to craft good legislation.
Big Dairy showed up to ensure that those 3 glasses of milk were put on the
Ensure, get it?
You know what I mean?
Ensure.
Yeah, I think it is a bit odd that dairy, that pieces of milk appear 3 times in a document. That's a perfect example of that. An actual expert will go, hey, maybe you don't have it on there 3 times. Maybe you have it on there just the once. That is a good example of dairy that you could have, but there's many other types of dairy.
But, you know, that yoga instructor, that nutritionist wasn't there during that committee hearing to provide that public commentary, that testimony.
Instructor.
You know, to tell you what was going on the other side of, you know, of why milk is not good for you, why you shouldn't be. There was no one there to push up against that argument. And so what you saw happen likely is big business came in there with their lobby team, and they articulated and they crafted it, and they brought in their own experts to help influence that conversation and ensure it and drive it in with a nail.
Well, I mean, two examples of this. One, honestly, before we even joined up together, I tried my damnedest to create a Texas Food Truck Association because food trucks were on the rise. They were everywhere, but then they were also getting shoved out for zoning, and they didn't have they weren't able to show up.
That was one of my bills, by the way.
Was it?
Yeah.
Nice.
You're welcome.
They get killed.
Yeah.
and so I tried really hard to go and get a bunch of food trucks to join together and create an association and hire me as a lobbyist and all that. And they just, they weren't interested. And so it was like, all right, well, you're going to get run over. And the other example is, honestly, Robert, what we've been talking with you about on the side about, cryptocurrency, or not cryptocurrency, cybersecurity. Thank you. Getting cybersecurity groups together to have a unified, exponentiated voice over there at the Capitol, and those decisions are being made. The people that show up are helping to inform them, and if a certain segment of the population that are actually experts in this don't show up, I mean,
there's no telling what's going to happen.
You just shit in your hand and see what you got. I mean, at that point, it is what it is. If you don't show up, somebody's going to make that decision. Somebody's going to have that conversation.
Yeah, it's going to have an adverse impact on your business, on your industry, and you're going to recognize that after the fact, post facto, right? And then you're going to be stuck there with your dick in your hand, right? And figuring out how to move forward, how to get through it, how to navigate the process.
Yeah.
That's when you're calling us. And so, we'll take the retainer on at that time too, and work with that particular client. But what we try to advocate is having that run ramp, having the ability to develop the rapport, cultivate the relationships with these legislators. That's what's driving the needle forward. Without that type of relationship building, you can throw any type of priority at the Texas legislature, but that doesn't mean it's going to stick. That doesn't mean you're going to be married, that they're going to marry and find some attraction to your idea.
All right. So for cybersecurity, for instance, or space or anything, maybe it's not an individual expert like myself. Maybe it's a PAC. So can you guys first explain what a PAC is for the people who have no idea? And then we
Ethics attorney.
Yeah, that's me. So a PAC is the acronym, I guess, for Political Action Committee. They are set up specifically to grab individual contributions from individual people to pull together and, like I said before, exponentiate your impact. So, the whole point of having a PAC is to give money to legislators, to candidates, elected officials, whatever. And really the whole point of that, and look, people can bitch and complain about it all they want, about, well, you're buying votes, you're buying this, you're bribing, all that. It's legal bribery, whatever. Okay, fine. But it is what it is, and it exists. So
and it is exactly that.
It may be.
Don't answer that, Kate.
But it's legal. So I don't know what to tell you.
It's a part of the process.
It's a part of the process. And if, money is unfortunately a very big part of the process. You don't win a race without money. You just don't. You can have gimmicks. You can get up on an oil rig, topless. And did you see that?
No, I have no idea what you're talking about.
There's a candidate for the Railroad Commission that the female got up on an oil rig topless and sent it out everywhere and was like, "This is I'm whatever. I'm running for whatever." And
that's freedom loving right there.
And she got
Made the runoff.
she made the
Sex
runoff,
sells.
and she got all of the exposure that she needed. Pun not intended.
That would have been a good pun, but
But-
all right.
But that's kind of the link that she's had to go to because she is not raising money.
Did she win?
She's in the
She's in the
runoff.
I
It
see.
worked.
It hasn't.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Wow.
so
Okay.
yeah.
My wife
but-
voted for her. Didn't even realize it.
Oh, really?
Sorry. Threw her under the bus.
But
Strike
the other side of that is, there is a gigantic amount of money going into these races. A state house race in Texas right now, minimum $250,000, I would guess, if not half.
And what is the lifetime of these?
Good question.
How long does it take to actually go through that entire process and actually get yourself elected or kicked out? So
Not
a couple
long.
months,
Yeah.
handful of months.
Yeah, it depends on the race. If it's a very solid R or D seat, it's a primary only race, so you could be done by March. Otherwise, you go through to November and have it there when it's R versus D. But I mean, a political action committee, you get a bunch of people that would otherwise, if Dustin's running for office, Chris could give him $100, I could give him $100, you could give him $100, or we could, three of us get together, have a PAC, put all of our money into it together, and then give him a $300 check. And it just kind of exponentiates the voice of that. $300 versus $100 is not very much, but when you get, everybody was going to give him $1,000, and then we have 20 people together, then all of a sudden we're giving him a really big check. And like it or not, that gets you access. You get FaceTime with that person with a big check.
Yeah, it's also power of a brand, law and numbers, right? There's a grassroots and a grass tops advocacy component that's built into this, and it's tied back to these voters at the end of the day, right? And so all of it is aligned in some sort of way within our system. And so again, to the point of it's an integral part of our process. They're here. They do serve a purpose. In terms of effectuating the change and getting folks elected, serving for marketing purposes, getting industry involved, and bringing people to the table. That's a viable part of our process. And here in Texas, again, coming back to us having a 2-year cycle, 18 months of that time is really spent out on the campaign trails, creating these new relationships, figuring out what the pulse is back in the market and what those priorities may look like and shape. That way we can then come back to our clients and say, hey, look, this is what's coming down the pike, or here's what our expert opinion might be on how the deck may fall in the next coming months.
And I know that I was shitting on the First Amendment earlier, but
he likes it.
But part of it is freedom of association, and there have been challenges to say you shouldn't be able to have PACs, and we need to get rid of PACs and all that. And I can appreciate the effort and all of that, but that is 100% freedom of association. If the government came in and said, we're going to write a new law that says you can't form together as a group and give money to people running for office, that is 100% a constitutional violation.
You think so?
Yeah.
Interesting. So a friend of mine came up with an interesting idea. I will not take credit for this one, but I thought it was interesting. He said, what if we created a PAC, and the entire purpose of this PAC was to find people who were less extreme than the other person that they're running for? So there's a runoff. There's two people. One of them is way right or way left, and the other person's slightly less, just even a tiny bit less. Give them money and just keep doing that and progressively walk it back into the center. What do you guys think of that?
You should take credit for that. It's a genius idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are a lot of groups out there, political groups, who survive just by keeping people pissed off, because they know that if they can make you pissed off and keep you pissed off, they can take your money. And once they take your money, ethics attorney here, there's very little constraints on what they can actually do with that money. They're not like a private 501c3. They can pretty much have carte blanche to do what they will with that money. And there are a lot of very well-fed folks in the state based purely on keeping people politically pissed off on both sides, quite frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. Look, I really like that idea.
I do too. I think there's a lot of merit to it.
The keeps you honest.
Yeah. I mean,
hold you at your word.
The problem comes, the whole problem with the process as it is right now is that, we have different party primaries before we end up at a general election. And I don't know how you do it differently, but we have to, each party has their own primary. If you want to win your primary, you have to be more Republican than your opponent, or more Democrat than your opponent, or more liberal than your opponent to win that primary. And then you have to scramble your ass back to the center to try and win the independents in the general election against the other side. And that's what happens in the presidentials all the time.
So why is that? I mean, I'm not naive, but I would like to hear your take on that. Why do you have to be more extreme than the guy next to you to win? Why can't you be more centrist? Why can't you be more moderate? And
it's been a game of chicken that's been playing out for the past 20 years, I would say. Maybe even further than that. In that, yes, you might be seen as this, and there's plenty of examples of this happening. You might be coming in as the most far-right crazy person in the world, but 10 years from now, that target has shifted so far to your right that you're seen as this crackball liberal who's going to, give everybody's money away and make us all communists. It happens all the time because you can't go further back towards the middle anymore. That bridge is burned, basically. The only route for you then, if you want to come in and challenge somebody, is to come out as the more extreme, as the more far right or far left candidate, because that's the only field that's out there. And as going back to my previous point of there's people out there who are paid to keep you pissed off to take your money, that's who's funneling and fueling those groups. They're there because they know those.
Give me an example.
Without naming names, there's a certain empowering organization in
Texas, sorry,
who has made a very good niche for themselves of finding far right candidates to run against folks that, for whatever reason, go against the dogma of this group, and they are well funded by maybe a handful of 4 or 5 very wealthy oil tycoons in the state, and their names aren't seen anywhere on any of the documents except for maybe the forming documents. But those messages being delivered are coming directly from those 4 or 5 people. So if you're a far-right group or a far-right voter in Texas, you're being influenced by a group of 4 or 5 different people that you have no idea even exist. But because they have billions of dollars, they're impacting the way you vote because those groups are telling you should be pissed off, and here is a whole list of made-up reasons why.
And they are blowing you up with social media and mail and all kinds of stuff to make sure that you are seeing that message. And they're spending so much money to do it. But and honestly, to not great success. But I think it's interesting psychologically messing with people and implanting in them.
But it might be just disrupting the norm within the political kind of landscape and creating kind of this new form of interaction with the government or with the legislature and the campaign folks on the elected.
Yeah, and I feel like I hear all the time, pundits being hyperbolic and saying, "Oh, there is no bottom. There's no bottom to this," and I don't know if there is. I don't know how to come back from the brink. There's got to be some kind of seismic shift or some. Like I was saying, at the Capitol. A lot of people going to jail or a lot of people dying or something really bad happening, showing that we've got to come back to the middle to get real stuff done. Because the edges of either party are not, they're bomb throwers. They're not working with the other side to get something done and actually pass a bill.
I think it's short memory. Fortunately, that group is pretty small.
It's small, but they're really loud.
They're loud, but I also think there's short memory spans that also exist kind of in just the general public or the voting bases, right? That they forget what happened 3 or 4 years ago, even though that person's still in office, right? So it's in the media cycle, it's in that news cycle, and then once it's done there, it's beyond people. And so they don't hold them accountable for past transgressions or votes that were ill-informed or that were caused, damage to their particular perspective, excuse me.
And I would say it's becoming easier to pick off incumbent elected officials these days, because once you have a voting record and once you actually have something I can attack you on directly, as opposed to just saying you're just a random general citizen and there's nothing.
I'm a car dealer.
Yeah, you're just a car dealer. There's nothing to compare you against politically. But if you have a voting record as a car dealer, I can find maybe 1 or 2 votes you might have taken that I can then turn into saying you're now a card-carrying member of the Communist Party of America.
That lemon you sold me. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. That lemon you sold me is now you're selling
or that
lemon.
Hummer.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, the vote that you take, the vote that you don't take. Sometimes they walk votes so that they don't have to be on the record voting for or against a certain bill.
Sure.
Well, then you're derelict in duty and you're not even showing up to your job and blah, 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 when really you were just standing in the back making sure you're not on record there. You can twist everything and anything.
So you don't agree with showing up to work?
All right. So for those playing along at home, I think now is the time to get your votes in and what you think these 3 fine gentlemen's political views are. So pause it if you need to. Write it down. Okay, who wants to go first?
All right.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm a Democrat.
Okay.
Republican,
but I lean libertarian.
Interesting. Do you guys care to wager what I am?
Republican.
Libertarian.
Million different ways I can see it going, which is good though, which is a good thing. Man, if I had to put money on it, go to Vegas and put money on it right now, I'd say libertarian, but more of a moderate libertarian.
I think that's pretty close, actually. I am very, very centrist, but I also really don't think the government's doing a particularly good job almost anywhere, at least every time I dig in. And that's usually a good sign. So I come to the computer security world. When someone hands me something, my first gut instinct is this is probably fine. And then I start playing with it, and I'm like, this is definitely not fine. And the further I go and the more I have done over my many copious years of doing this, the more I've realized everything's not fine. Everything's always very broken. And I don't have to spend much time looking at it. I can just see a misspelling somewhere. I'm like, okay, their QA is terrible. I'm going to be able to find all kinds of issues. Copyright's out of date. This thing isn't patched. Like, I don't even have to go very far at all. I have a similar impression of the government. It's just so full of that kind of stuff. And from what I've actually talked to, I've been, 2 floors under the Pentagon. I've seen how the sausage is made. I know that it is not as, sparkly and clean and as great as everyone hopes it would be. And that makes me much more wary of implementing laws because I know the unintended consequences are just hiding right around the corner. And I know no one smart is even in the room. You know what I mean? Or if they are smart, they are totally biased in one direction or another.
Right.
So that forces me to be much more moderate than I might normally be, if that makes sense.
I mean, look, and I'm not going to walk it back.
Sure.
I am a Democrat. I've
Okay,
always
it's fine.
voted. I've always voted Democrat. I've always been that. My parents are super liberal, all that. But I'm also more apolitical, jaded, honestly, a little bit from working in it. Same thing. Like, we see the sausage made. We have been the sausage. We have been the sausage casing. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that it's a game. It's not a game because there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of lives at stake and all of that.
Yeah, of course.
But
it's very serious stuff.
But I mean, there are kind of a certain set of rules. There are a certain set of players. It's kind of people say it's like 3D chess, and it is. I mean, I kind of take, and we started off with this talking about kind of pulling yourself out of the politics of it and everything. We take our own personal politics out of it entirely when we go up there, and I honestly have gotten to a point where I'm seeing more of the person than the party. Maybe not when I vote, but when I'm up there at the Capitol, because at this point, the parties are so far apart that it's really hard to even marry who's going to do a good job based on the party anymore.
Yeah, I hate to say this, and I certainly hate to say it in a recorded setting, but
we can always bleep this whole section.
We might have to be a very big bleep. But I think we've passed a threshold in this country. I really have, as far as the partisanship.
Yeah.
I think the actual public policy is now at the back of anybody's mind. It's not even an afterthought, quite frankly, when it comes to passing laws. I think we've gone to such a hyper-partisan society, and not just in politics. I think everything we do in our day-to-day lives is seen through the lens of party politics. And I don't see a way to draw that back to where it used to be. I don't see a way for it not to be so hypersensitive when it comes to political issues anymore. And that, again, this is probably a very something I've regretted in the future, but I think it's leading us towards a very, very dark place as a society.
I agree. I mean, we're being exploited on that as well. I mean, we saw, whatever your thoughts on Russia and the 2020 elections and all that, but there were definitely hacks and hackers in Russia that were feeding misinformation, specifically pushing the partisan divide in that election cycle and currently.
That is for a different podcast.
But I mean, that's hyper partisanship's being exploited by other external factors.
Right.
I will get somebody in here to talk about that specifically. Don't you worry. I know quite a bit about it. How about yourself? Any comments?
I mean, closing thoughts for me, again, just kind of being the eternal optimist of the group. Again, believe in the process, believe that our forefathers put in some guiding documents and principles that were here for a reason. For me, there's good people in the industry that are trying to create good value and good policy behind that. I know that us three are here. That's part of our mission with our firm. And there's plenty of politicians outside of these bad actors that really do good justice and are honestly underpaid and for the type of servant leadership and the value that they bring. I want to continue to give them the glory for what they do every day too, because without them, we don't have an industry where we exist either. So to me, I'm just a firm believer that, the process here is something that we can all work into and engage and do so in a way that, as Chris said, party politics really don't have to play a part in it. We're all people at the end of the day, and there's different strokes for different folks, but finding the way to get it all to work and kind of bring it all together for me is why I show up and go to work every day, and I love what I do. So.
All right, gentlemen, how can people follow you or find you or?
Sure.
What's the
We're
best
on
way?
Twitter at Salient Strat TX, online on LinkedIn. All of us are on LinkedIn as well. And January through May, every odd year, we'll be at the Capitol daily. You can find us there as well. So,
Personal Instagram, the Chris Sanch. I'm there on Instagram, post a lot. So
Great.
yeah, you'll
I'm
get
not
into
going to put my Instagram up.
No, you're not going to do that. No, you know
no.
better.
I got dragged into Instagram against
that's
my
right.
will
Yeah, I
like
forgot that. Yeah.
within the last year. I've been
Well,
trying to
technically,
push back.
me too, because of this podcast. It's funny because I tell people I don't have one Instagram account. I just have 1 million, which is not too far from the truth, actually. I think it's more than that. But anyway, so guys, I really want to thank you for coming. This
fun.
is
Our pleasure.
Yeah,
you.
this was great. So hopefully we can do this again sometime.
It'd be great.
Absolutely.
All right.
Happy to be back. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.